Hello to the lecture on lean entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship education, international entrepreneurship. We are doing a number of topics today to also scratch import topics in entrepreneurship research to give you a more complete picture. Lean entrepreneurship is a discipline or an approach which has been developing the last 10-15 years. And I think for academic startups, it's an approach which comes close to science-related activities anyway. It's working in iteration, it's working based on hypotheses, and it's something most academic incubators and many more outside of academia use nowadays. It's faster, quicker, and it's more science and validity based. Actually, it goes back to our idea that to maximize customer value while minimizing waste. So coming much faster, closer to the actual customer you have and create the right product process you want to offer to a market. In a frame of sustainable transformation, one could also translate it into a slogan, maximize impact while minimizing profit. Really be there for your customers and the market, be not there for your own use in any way. The main approach is actually going in iterations, as you would do in science as well, for most in engineering. You build something, you test it, you learn out of it, you modify, and you go in the next iteration. And that's the same way as lean entrepreneurship is acting, building a prototype, which has not to be complete, which has not to be perfect, testing it, mostly at the customer, refining it, modifying it, and testing it again. And that all based on hypotheses. And that also reflects principles. You always validate. You have a learning curve and a learning process in iterations in this model. You use really accounting systems, but it's really important to have data and facts what you are doing. Most smaller enterprises don't do that. That's important in lean entrepreneurship, that you really know in numbers and facts what you are doing. You also could put it like that. You define, you ideate, you prototype, you test, and you do it again. It resembles what I was presenting at this lecture on sustainable entrepreneurship, where we actually have built the sustainable return on investment measurement into a lean entrepreneurship process, which means going in iterations to formulating hypotheses towards sustainable impacts, testing this hypothesis, modifying this hypothesis, testing this hypothesis, and that goes in iterations again and again until we have a business model as for our startup which serves sustainability and creates impact. If you see that, it resembles actually many other processes and concepts that are around us. This graphic just combines design thinking, lean entrepreneurship, and agile project management. As you see in design thinking, ideas developed in teams under a certain set of methods, under a certain methodology. That can be, let's say, the input of an iterated process in lean entrepreneurship, and it can be an input several times, not only once. And that all has to be accompanied by agile project management. So that whole thing from idea to really running a company could be a process from design thinking, lean entrepreneurship towards agile project management. What can we build out of research there? I show you research which actually combines lean entrepreneurship and education. where this setup of lean entrepreneurship, self-regulated learning, doing something in groups as done by design thinking and lean entrepreneurship has been tested. That's an article from a close colleague at the University of Twente, self-regulated learning, team learning and project performance and entrepreneurship education, learning a lean startup environment. How did it work? First, a whole theoretical body was analyzed and considered and ended up in hypotheses which can be derived from the whole concept of lean entrepreneurship, that self-regulated learning is positively associated with learning performance, and that team learning is positively associated with learning performance. How do you conduct such research? We could do it in our modules as well, but of course we could take one subject. Here that was one subject with 172 participants that were grouped in teams. So you actually had 2 levels. That's actually referring to what we were speaking about before, a hierarchical linear modeling approach. So you have 2 levels. You have this individual level, that's bachelor students, and you have an upper level that are the teams. And that can be approached by really using hierarchical linear modeling as done in this research study. As you see, you have tested the variables on a second level, and then you introduced in the model 3 the variable on the individual level, and it turns out to be significant. On the 10% level, as you see down, it is 1 star behind the number. That means self-regulated learning indeed has a positive effect, which is not extremely high because the model quality does not improve dramatically, but it's there. So the hypothesis can be, don't have to be rejected, the hypothesis can be verified. The null hypothesis has to be rejected in this case. And when testing on the team level and introducing also the individual level, also team learning turns out to be positively related on a significant statistical level. That's something where you actually just take the concepts of lean entrepreneurship and teamwork into the educational context. But that's not the only one. Of course, lean entrepreneurship needs to be refined and needs to be tested many times more. So that should be something you do in the future with your own research if you go in this direction. About entrepreneurship education, I think entrepreneurship education was propelled massively in variation, diversity, and what could be done in Europe through the European Institute of Innovation Technology. We have been part of that, and we have been analyzing what conclusions can actually be drawn from entrepreneurship education, what should be done, what shouldn't be done. I mean, there's a various diverse field. You of course have the discussion, what do we achieve with that? Is it a sensibilization for students to think about self-employment, entrepreneurship? Do we really learn skills? Do we learn knowledge about it? What do we hand over to students? And what turns out are some conclusions that still have to be tested, but that seem to be quite clear. You have a problem when you work in education with pure practitioners, because practitioners have a clear output-oriented view, whereas teachers, professors, educational staff at universities has a more process-based view. I want you to learn, not directly to create an enterprise. And that's something to consider when offering education. You're in a learning process, not in an executing process. And practitioners want you to be in an executing process. Another learning is that entrepreneurship itself needs to be freed from the chains of purely business administration, because many people think that's part of business administration, whereas actually startups, as a set mostly of teams, which all the problems Stephen faced. So we are actually deep into sociological, psychological questions. You're deep into other disciplines when you look at that. That's German Science Foundation pattern of what entrepreneurship research actually is addressing. And you're close to geography, of course, migration, stuff around you, educational institutions form where entrepreneurship happens. Therefore, Munich and Berlin are the hubs in Germany. You have question about laws country-wise, but also at the entrepreneurial ecosystem where you are. Psychology plays a role, of course, business administration, sociology. So there are many, many disciplines. Entrepreneurship, that's the conclusion, should not be considered being only a discipline in business administration. On the contrary, business administration comes much later and is probably one of the most unimportant parts in the beginning of a startup. Commercializing education actually lowers down quality. With this expression, actually, we have to define quality. And if quality means diversity, if quality means covering all sustainability aspects, that's very true. Commercial enterprises, when students start to pay for their education, they expect something out of it, and they also expect something financially out of it. So you limit the field entrepreneurship can develop and can actually grow itself in academic institutions as more academic institutions are commercialized. Making entrepreneurship education academic discipline, that's actually what we do here by having a Master of Science in Innovation Management, Entrepreneurship and Sustainability, and really establish entrepreneurship as also academic discipline next to other academic disciplines. Of course, it is a discipline which is by nature transdisciplinary, which focus on customers, which focus on society, which focus on grand social challenges, which also focus on real scientific results, because many things have to be based on real scientific outcomes. And so it is a transdisciplinary discipline, but it is a science discipline when you establish entrepreneurship as such, and not only at the sideline of academic activities. What also could be shown in research is that learning outcomes and learning methods and learning outcomes do not correlate much. We had once a doctoral study, and we were actually selecting all the entrepreneurial educational offers at German universities, more than 500, where we took a random sample out of that of 70, and then we were looking at correlations of all these different learning methods, and you hardly find them. It's a chaotic structure, it's a chaotic picture of what is offered at universities. So to find a unique picture of learning methods and learning outcomes isn't there. And there's a huge field of research. Which learning methods lead to what learning outcomes? And what actually should we offer students in educational efforts? And it's still a discipline which has many, many question marks, and many things cannot answer. It's a broad field that still has to be done. And what really turns out, multidisciplinarity, multinationality, diversity itself in many aspects has a positive effect of what comes out in an entrepreneurial process, but also in entrepreneurial learning in teams, learning certain set of skills you will need as entrepreneur. One example where we actually studied that very carefully was EIT, European Institute of Innovation and Technology, Climate Kick Summer School. Climate Kick is a consortium of universities in Europe that does yearly a summer school of 5 or 6 weeks, where students are grouped in smaller teams and work on business solution towards climate change mitigation or climate change solutions. just as a tip, we will do the same next year with another network, Enhanced Sustainable Entrepreneurship Summer School in 22. You will hear about it more, but let's come to the study we did. So we were measuring in the study the results from students before they started the summer school and after they started the summer school. Ex post, ex ante measurements. We were going into entrepreneurial attitude, subjective norm, perceived behavioral control, efficacy, do you really believe what you do, or entrepreneurial intention. And what you see, except of the norms, which did not change much, all aspects were changing positively. So the entrepreneurial attitudes were increasing, the efficacy and really believing that I can do something as entrepreneur was increasing, and the entrepreneurial intention was increasing. And the next step, we are looking at some statistics about this change in attitude. And what you see, that the students' orientation towards entrepreneurship played a quite big role, but also some role models, and it was much stronger for entrepreneurship beliefs than for climate beliefs. In the next study, we will certainly look into causation and effectuation. And that's something I already mentioned here to be very important as understanding of entrepreneurship, because a classical discipline is a causation discipline. To explain you that here, that's a good example as a fridge. You cook a meal for a friend, and when you do so, you have two choices. You look in the refrigerator what's there and you make something out of it. That would be effectuation. Or you go in a cookery book and you look up what you all need for doing so. That would be causation. Then you go shopping and you have everything ready. The first one would be a real structured process in going for a certain goal which has been clearly defined, and the way towards the goal is clearly defined by the recipe. The second, you define a goal very roughly, cooking a meal, and you do your best in a very creative and iterative way to reach your goal. So that makes also the differences between effectuation and causation. Here are 5 dimensions which really distinguish the differences between effectuation and causation. Affordable loss versus expected returns, strategic alliances versus competitive advantage, exploitation of contingencies, exploitation of pre-existing knowledge, controlling an unpredictable future, predicting an uncertain one. What turns out over the years, entrepreneurship is hardly to plan. Business plans will change over time, so it's hardly fully possible to follow a causation approach, because there are many uncertainties and you have to build in many changes. And on the other hand side, working only on an effectuation side will not come to positive ends as well, because you never ever get a structure and management into a startup. So it will be a mix of both finally. But what's actually new in education and in reality also part of lean entrepreneurship is a stronger focus on effectuation methods, because that makes things much faster, and that also leads to out-of-the-box thinking and to out-of-the-box results in the end. There are 3 names in entrepreneurship that are actually mentioned when speaking about effectuation and causation. March, Münzberg and Wieck, all 3 are very big thinkers of entrepreneurial approaches, entrepreneurial concepts, a philosophy behind entrepreneurial activities. When you see an entrepreneur, very experienced entrepreneurs might go much more on effectuations than unexperienced entrepreneurs. That's a very rough table here, but of course if you are not really experienced and the situation is uncertain, you will build more up on causation. If you are very experienced, you might go more in the direction of effectuation. Coming to the last topic for today, and that's international entrepreneurship. As you know, that has always been a discussion how much migration is necessary in a country and what can migrants actually do. And you have different approaches from different countries where you need a set of qualifications for entering Australia. You might not need it for coming to Europe. You certainly need it for coming to the United States. If I look at Germany, there were several waves of migration. You had a big wave just after the fall of the wall caused by Yugoslavian war. We had a wave with this war in Syria where a lot of people were coming to us. And when you look at it, there are several times people leaving Germany or people coming to Germany. Actually, the most economic associations or business associations state that we need a certain level of migrations to have enough labor in Germany. We have a shortage of really qualified labor in Germany nowadays, and there is actually quite a need for people entering Germany and doing these jobs where we don't just have enough employees for them. But what are actually migrants? Then the picture gets quite complicated. Migrants can be everyone. I mean, migrants are fleeing from a war in Syria, but migrants also coming from the United States as employees here, migrants coming from all over the world. And therefore you have a very different, diverse set of migrants in one country. That also shows the picture where the most migrants are in Berlin. You see that they are in the middle. But when we speak about middle, we speak about people studying here, we speak about people working here, coming from other countries in Europe, coming from the United States. We probably don't speak about huge numbers of asylum seekers in the middle of Berlin. So it's a quite different story. And I don't think in entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship education, we are not so much concerned about highly educated people entering the German labor market. We are more concerned about people who need entrepreneurship and self-employment to build themselves their own life, like many asylum seekers, like people fleeing from wars, coming as migrants to Europe. For most of them, it's the only way of really creating a life in another country and starting an enterprise. And that was something which was of interest in one of our research. Do they actually have the opportunity to do so? And in theory, we came up actually saying yes. As more distant you are, as more you probably see opportunities to create your own business coming from a different culture. But not too distant, because then you cannot adopt this culture you are coming from to what you are in as migrants. So we expected actually inversely U-shaped relationship as displayed here. So the cultural distance should be somehow not negative, not positive, but inversely U-shaped. There should be a certain distance, and that enables you to see many more opportunities than people from the same culture, the Germans, and people from very, very distant cultures. And we were actually testing that, and not very surprisingly, but we actually could confirm our hypothesis that there is something like inversely U-shaped relationship. So then people from a not really distant, not far away distant culture actually see many more opportunities than the Germans itself. So in this way, it shows that migration can actually bring a lot of vivid ideas and creativity and entrepreneurial ideas and entrepreneurship in countries. This diversity is very good, and these people see many more opportunities which wouldn't have been seen from original inhabitants there. But if the distance gets too far, it's problematic, because the adaptability of very distant approaches might not be given. Another study we did, actually approaching international entrepreneurship, was when studying the startups under the roof of Factory Berlin. We speak about 10,000 startups. There are very big ones, very famous ones, and very small ones. And we were looking at Twitter, how the communication patterns of the startups actually structure. So we're actually looking, do they communicate via Twitter, or do they get comments via Twitter in an international setting, or very local? So we were looking at time zones of Twitter communication for every single startup under the roof of Twitter as a transnational information innovation diffusion. So we were looking at time zones from Factory Berlin of all the 10,000. And quite surprisingly, it's very locally oriented. There are only a very small quantity of companies that actually communicates or has links over 2 or 3 time zones. It's actually surprisingly low. Where many people might think Berlin is a very international city, yes, if you walk along a street, you might get this impression. If you look at their startups, they're extremely locally oriented. There were a few words that came up a couple of times. We also were theorizing that, and we're gathering that. That's another discipline when you actually use some software methods to go into semantic analysis. And when you summarize that, actually it was quite disappointing how low the number of really international startups is in Berlin. And actually that should be a focus of investors, of all startup members of the community, but also educational effort of getting much more internationality into the startup scene of Berlin. Summarizing that all what we did here about entrepreneurship research, before you start actually writing an essay, there are a couple of things that are important. You should be clear about the underlying perspective of your study. Do you really go a positivistic way, which says I can really measure what I want to measure, which goes more along the line as natural science, biology, chemistry, physics? Or do you go a constructivistic way and saying, no, nothing can be measured, everything is different and is socially constructed by our minds? So I have to use more qualitative approaches. I'm going along another line when I design a research study as expected from you. Or you go somewhere in the middle. It's realistic or pragmatic to do what I do. I believe both sides are right and both sides have strong points, but I try to realistically approach a research topic. And that also depends on, do you do a deductive research, which would go more on a positivistic side because you formulate hypotheses and you test this hypothesis, or do you go a more inductive way? You don't formulate hypotheses, you approach a field very openly, mostly with more open methods, observation, open interviews, but also open algorithm-driven methods in data. So there are many things, but you do it in an inductive way. You're creating knowledge. You're not testing deductive knowledge. Do you use theory or do you use a model? I mean, a theory is something that always can be tested and operationalized. If not, like example, system theory or network theory or grounded-based theory. The name is theory, but there are no theories. There are models. They cannot be tested itself, cannot be broken down in hypotheses that can be tested. That are models that modeling social reality, social phenomenon. You have to consider there's always a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. You're testing actually always the null hypothesis and not the hypothesis you have in mind. And that's something to keep in mind when actually building up methods. And there is something as falsification. You attempt always when you do research to reject your own hypothesis and not to prove your own hypothesis. And importantly, you have to keep in mind what's methodology, epistemology and ontology. Method means always the single thing you do, the regression analysis you do, the sampling approach you do, the kind of interviews you do, open or structured, that are all methods. Your methodology is your box of methods all together. You make a choice, be simple or not, and what kind of sampling, how you analyze that, triangulation when you go qualitative, statistical methods when you go quantitative. So the methodology is your box of tools, of methods. So epistemology is your entire approach, that's the entire study you do. The relevance, the theory, the decision whether you do deductive or inductive, the conclusion you draw out of it. That's the entire piece you are doing as a research study. And ontology is how that piece relates to all other pieces of research in a quite bigger scientific world. You have to keep all four levels in mind actually when you approach a scientific study and do so. Literature, as always, you find back on ISIS. And thank you a lot and good luck.